Hello, everyone. Welcome to the group. I want to introduce you to our expert, Joseph Morrison. Do you prefer Joseph or Joe?
Joe is fine.
Okay. And he does a lot of things, has a lot of experience with nonprofits, but in this group, he has decided that he wants to focus on boards and all that that entails. So he is our board expert for the How to Start a Nonprofit 501c3 Nonprofit Universe group. So welcome, Joe.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
It's good to have you. I'm so glad we get to do this. So
I am too. Thanks for having me. This is really going to be a wonderful time talking about your board and how to develop it and how to do all the things you need to. I'm excited by it.
well, good. So I know a little bit about you, but tell everyone else about your experiences in the nonprofit field.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. I'm not sure that even you know this, but I've probably spent the last 40 years in the nonprofit sector, and I've filled just about every role imaginable. And I could go on for hours about my background, but I've been in every position. So as I think about it, I've been a volunteer, I've been a committee board member, I've been a board officer, and I've been the chairman of several boards of directors. So I also have served as part-time staff person. I've been responsible for, and as a program officer, as a volunteer recruitment person, as a fundraising expert, as a program management person, as all the way up into the CEO or executive director roles. I began my work with the Kiwanis organization, believe it or not, not as an employee, but as a volunteer.
Oh,
And
wow.
Kiwanis is a service club like the Rotary, for those of you who don't know. But I was the founding secretary of a local chapter, and I served in all kinds of positions there too, eventually becoming the chapter president, where I served for, I can't even remember how many years, but many years. And then I even moved on to serving, becoming the lieutenant governor of the state. So I was very active in learning about how organizations work and how boards in particular work through my work at the Kiwanis organization. I had to learn Robert's Rules of Order and all of that kind of stuff. What the roles of the president and secretary and treasurer were. Really, Kiwanis was my, what's the word? Not my litmus test, but it was my, it was sort of cutting my teeth
Yeah.
on what boards were all about. I've also worked directly for big and small organizations alike, some that you've heard of, like the Boy Scouts of America and Habitat for Humanity, and some you've never heard of, like Interfaith Housing Development Corporation, which is a local Philadelphia-based housing corporation. I consider myself a professional fundraiser who loves planning. Okay, I've been a fundraiser, a paid professional, and I've been very successful at it, but I'm a planner at heart. That's my gift. Moving people and organizations from their point A to their point B. And usually that means from having little or no money to having an abundance of money, right? Because fundraising is a central part of every nonprofit startup and operation. So when I say I've done it all, I'm really not exaggerating. It's been a wonderful, sometimes exhilarating, sometimes exhausting, but ultimately rewarding journey.
So, yes, it does sound like you have been in every position imaginable. And many probably we hadn't even mentioned here.
Yes.
So, how has being in these positions helped you help other nonprofit leaders, especially new nonprofits and founders?
Yeah, well, what my background has done or does currently is to help me understand the pains and the frustrations of the nonprofit founder. You see, I've been where they are, right? I've been alone and confused. I've been not sure what to do next, not sure who to trust, not sure where to go to get good information. And I've also been to the mountaintop with blessings coming my way after wave of success. So I bring a very unique perspective to the table because I've been on both sides of the coin, the volunteer board member side and the paid staff side. And I've been to the mountaintop and in the valley, right? I've had my successes, but I've had just as many, probably more failures. And I can relate to the founder in ways that many other people cannot. If you've been to your destination, you're probably pretty good guide to help someone else get there, right?
Right.
And that's how I see myself, as a guide to help bring a unique perspective to the table. And I can also understand how fundraising in particular and organizational management and how board members relate to and impact every aspect of the nonprofit. And so I understand ways to get the board involved in fundraising and to manage a board of directors, which is something a lot of people seem perplexed about.
Yeah.
You know, in the addictions world, they talk about lived experience, right? That you have to, you know, when you're in recovery, you like to deal with people who have been where you are. They have lived experience. Well, I have lived experience in the nonprofit sector.
Mhm.
I don't have a lot of fancy degrees, but I have practical, real world experience that allows me to help nonprofit leaders capitalize on my successes and hopefully avoid my mistakes.
And I love what you said about having been there, and when you take into account that you've had 40 years of these experiences, you know, a lot of new consultants these days, and it's part of the online business these days. They talk about, oh, you can have your target audience to be anybody as long as you're one step ahead of them,
Right.
you know? And when it's people like you and me who have been in nonprofit world for a long time, we're not just one step ahead. We are 20, 50, 40, 100 steps ahead, you
Right.
know. We we understand, you know, what goes on and what's coming up and the pitfalls to look for because we've been there, done that, and probably stepped in a few.
Right. Exactly correct.
Yeah, so I love that you said that.
Thank you.
So, what successes have you achieved in the positions of, particularly the board positions that you've had?
Yeah, well, I've had lots of successes. I've had many successes that I can think of. You know, the first one that came to mind had to relate to money, so I have to tell you that one. You know, I remember when I got my first grant, for instance, right?
Mhm.
And it was thrilling. I know it has nothing to do with the board, but I have to mention that because it was almost a pivotal point. It was a $5,000 grant that I got from Kellogg's Foundation. And I had written to them about a project that I wanted to start called a Breakfast of Champions. And it was a unique kind of, well, we won't get into the details. It was a unique program, and I had asked them for $5,000. And I remember when I got the letter from Kellogg's, and they gave me the permission not only to use the name, but they also sent $5,000 with it. And
Oh,
I
wow.
was just thrilled. I mean, I was over the moon about this thing, and it just helped me to realize that, you know, you don't get unless you ask, right? And sometimes you can have this wild, crazy idea, and this is particularly true of nonprofit founders. They can have this idea that they're not sure if anybody's going to get behind. But then when someone steps up and, you know, does what Kellogg's did for me, it just buoys you, right? It lifts you up and makes you think that you can do anything, right? So
Right.
it's really wonderful to get that kind of success under your belt. So that was the first thing that came to mind when I was looking at that question. The other thing that I think I really want to highlight is that when I was with the Boy Scouts of America, I had a district that I was responsible for, right? And so I was able to have a board, if you will, my own board that was related to a particular geographic area within Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And so I once replaced the whole board of directors, right? 7 members in one meeting using their own bylaws to do it because they were totally ineffective. They were nothing but naysayers and they needed to go. And I took them by surprise with their own bylaws, right? Removed them all and then recruited 13 more people to replace them in the very next meeting. So
That
it
was a
was
feat.
It was an amazing feat. And I was surprised myself that I was able to do it. But the point is, I used their own bylaws to make it happen. And that's the importance of having bylaws. And we're going to talk a little bit about that later. So that's a second thing that I can think of. I once also turned around a whole organization that was floundering. And that was when I served as executive director of the Interfaith Housing Development Corporation. And the way I did that is I first came in and I expanded the board with really highly capable people, skilled leaders, right, who knew what they were doing and could open up all kinds of resources to us, which then in turn helped us to triple our budget in a 3-year period. And in that same time, I increased the staff from about 4 people to, I think it was up to 11 people. And I increased the number of houses that we renovated, because that's what the organization did, is renovate houses for low-income families. And we increased that production from, when I stepped in, they were doing 3 a year. 3 years later, we were up to 16 houses a year. So we really ramped up our production, our board, our money, and we really transformed that organization. So I feel really proud of that particular success.
Yeah.
So that's another one. Perhaps probably my biggest success or my greatest success that I always think back on was a $10 million mixed income community that I helped create when I was the director of finance for Habitat for Humanity, called Emerald Hollow. It was a 75 unit community that sprang up from a literal cornfield, right? And that particular project gained national exposure because we got Trading Spaces TV show involved in it. And they did an episode on that particular project. And it was just thrilling to be able to do that. But what I learned from that project as it relates to the board is that, again, the board can make or break your project, whatever it is you're doing, because when I first proposed this to the board, they were a little bit skeptical, but eventually they got behind it big time and they made it happen, right? And so you can have these ideas, and if people don't get behind it, it's not gonna go well. Because when I first proposed the idea, people said it couldn't be done, but I proved them wrong, and lives were changed for the better because of it. And it had a lot to do with the people that were sitting around the table at the Habitat for Humanity board. So I try to use these things that I've learned from my past experiences to help other nonprofit leaders gain success in their own organizations. And I've seen many nonprofits that I've consulted with grow tremendously as a result. The most recent has blossomed from a small $100,000 a year organization to a multi-million-dollar one in just a 5-year period. So when you've got the right people at the helm, you can make anything happen.
Right. Yeah. It all starts with the board.
It does. All
And
of these successes that I've talked about had everything to do with the right people, right? It had
right.
the board of directors got behind these things and helped it and made it work. So yeah, the board is key.
Yeah. So what is the first thing aspiring founders need to know about the board of directors, since this is your
Uh,
area of expertise?
Yeah, well, I think I've already said it. First and foremost, the board can make or break you. Okay. You've got to have the right people sitting around the table. And not only do you have to have the right people, those people have to understand their roles and responsibilities uh, appropriately. Okay. They have to understand what it is they're supposed to do, how they're supposed to do the job that you've asked them to do. Now, not long ago, I wrote an article called "The 10 Things I Wish I Knew Before I Joined a Board of Directors." Because, it's before 10 things I wish I knew before I joined a board, not afterwards, but before I board. So, because if I'd known these things, I might not have joined the board.
Yeah.
And so I'd like to review this article that I wrote for your audience now, because I think these points really might be helpful to your listeners in understanding what they should be thinking about when they're developing their boards. Would that be okay if I did that?
Absolutely. We'd love to hear.
Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is that the board, not the CEO, is accountable. Okay? Board members need to understand that it's not the CEO, but the board that's at the box at the top of the organizational chart, right? And being in that top box means accountability for everything that happens in the organization. The buck doesn't stop with the CEO, but with the board. And for an example, let me tell you about an organization that I was working with, not for, but working with as a consultant. For several years, this organization covered their expenses by spending down every penny of a $1.5 million endowment. And every year, the board of high-powered business people approved a budget that actually planned for income from bequests. Now, bequests are those things that people give you when they die, right? As if this board could predict when their donors might die, right?
And how big the donor would be.
And how big they would be, right? So when things finally came to a head, the board's response was to go to the executive director and say, "What are you going to do about this, executive director?" Right? It never occurred to them that they had been accountable for the mess all along, right? So the board corporately is ultimately accountable when things go right and when things go wrong. And it needs to know how to put that accountability into practice. So that's the first thing that's really, really important. Know who's at the top of the box on that organizational chart.
Right.
The second thing that I think is really as important is that a board should never micromanage. Some boards see micromanagement as the road to accountability. Some see it as a detriment, but they can't seem to stop sometimes, right? Either way, if your board is micromanaging, they're on the road to failure. Again, another example, an organization that I know had come through a time of financial hardship, as many startup nonprofits do, and they had eliminated their debt in the process, and now they were operating from a period of fiscal strength. But the board was still in sort of this mental hardship mode, right? Scrutinizing every purchase, no matter how small it was. And so I remember they took 10 minutes at a board meeting once to investigate why the staff went to one store versus another, where they could have saved, and I'm not kidding, $20 on a $200 item. The staff knew that every move they made was going to be scrutinized and second guessed. And eventually they became unable to operate. They became immobilized. And so the board saw this as further proof of the need for scrutiny. And that cycle eventually totally crippled the organization. So micromanagement is the opposite of accountability. True accountability is proactive and preventative, while micromanagement is reactive and fear-based. So a board should never micromanage. The third thing that I wish I knew before I joined a board is that my involvement will not fix a dysfunctional board. Okay. Sometimes our egos get in the way, and we think that our involvement with the board will finally fix whatever problems they have. And, whether it be poor attendance or bickering and feuds to the countless other issues that boards face. And I have to realize that my personality and skills alone as a new board member will never solve these, or even as a founder, will never solve those problems. It will simply bring one more person into the mix to endure and personally probably exacerbate the problem. And so I can give you a personal example about how this happened too. I had an organization that was in a rural area, and these board members had to drive sometimes for as much as an hour to get to their board meetings, only to find when they got there that there was no quorum, right? They didn't have enough people to operate the organization, to do their business. And so frustrated, they instituted policies that removed board members who failed to attend meetings. And so they ended up losing those board members entirely, right? The reason, well, aside from reviewing reports, the board did virtually nothing of significance for the organization, right? They came together really to talk. It was a social club. And so once the board refocused its purpose and then refocused its meetings, attendance really shot up and was almost always 100%. They started doing things and making decisions. And so the whole structure of the organization changed. And then the new board members that came in could be assured that board meetings wouldn't be a waste of their time. That's really, really critical. We cannot waste our board members' time, and we cannot assume that my involvement is going to fix those problems.
Right.
So the fourth thing that I wish I knew is that my time on the board does not equal my money. Okay, I'm going to say that again. My time on the board does not equal money. Every board member should have, every board rather, should have a policy requiring board members to donate to the organization to the best of their means.
Mhm.
Now, this is not a fundraising. This is a living by example issue, right? If the board doesn't believe the organization is worth investing in, why should anybody else, right? How can we ask others to give generously when we haven't done so ourselves?
Yeah.
This particular example that I'm about to tell you about breaks my heart. But I had a situation where some of the board members of this nonprofit, which served low-income families, reserved some of their seats for recipients of the service, right? So their clients served on their board. And as a condition of a large gift, a donor wanted to be assured that the board had donated, 100% of the board had donated, right?
Mhm.
And so when the client I'll call them client board members, the
Yeah.
client board members were asked, what amount could you give, even if it's just 25 cents? Every single one of them gave, right? One even wept as she handed over a $1 bill. She said something like, this is a real honor. No one's ever asked me to do this. No one's ever asked me to participate and to give in this way before. And she was she was surprised and honored and shocked. And she gave. But you know who didn't give? A lot of the non-client board members. They became angry, saying that, well, I was never told that I would have to donate my money and my time, and they didn't give. And they were shamed by the client board members, right? So this whole thing could have been solved with a giving policy. And with a giving policy in place, prospective board members would know that what is expected of them, and that they were expected to give before they joined the board, or once they joined the board. But they know that in advance, and before some donor comes along and puts them on the spot. Right. So that particular point I think is really important. My time does not equal my money on the board. We need both from you, Mr. Board Member or Ms. Board Member.
Right. Well, and just to that point too, a lot of times I hear from founders, I need to find board members who are as passionate as me about this cause.
Mhm.
And one way that you can gauge passion
Mhm.
is by how much they give.
That's just true.
Because just think about it and open up your own checkbook or look at your own bank statement. Where does your money go? Because that's where your heart lies.
Absolutely correct. Now, I would rephrase that if I could,
Sure.
not to disagree, because I do agree with you, but I would rephrase it and say it's not how much you give, right? It is whether it's a significant gift to you,
True.
right?
Yeah,
Because
I agree
somebody
with
who's
that.
not only making, $10,000 a year, $10
Right.
is a significant gift.
Right.
Right? And so
Absolutely.
that's the only caveat I'd say. If it's a significant gift, that's what's important to people giving, and that they give anything.
Right. Totally in agreement with you. Okay.
So that was the fourth thing. The fifth thing that I wish I knew before I joined a nonprofit board is that the board and CEO relationship is critical for success.
Mhm.
If the board's relationship with the ED isn't great, or it stinks, or there are hard feelings between the board and the staff overall, this is going to carry into every decision made by the organization. The board CEO relationship is like a marriage. It requires work. It also requires a great deal of trust and communication. And without these two ingredients, the organization is likely to fail. I've been part of an organization where an ED spent 20 years growing this organization, and it was a nationally recognized one. I'm not going to say who it was, but it was a widely copied model for providing service. And the board began attracting heavy hitters, many of who joined for the status of being affiliated with that particular group, but who felt little passion, to your point, for the mission. right?
Right.
And so a rift was created between the board, who was mostly concerned about the organization's finances, which, by the way, were in great shape,
Mhm.
and that rift between the board and the staff, who were mostly concerned about meeting the community need, right? That's
Mhm.
what they're there to do. And so after a few years of battling, the ED retired early. And so what's happened is when at the time that I wrote this article, and I don't know how long it continued, but for a 2-year period after that point, the board was still arguing over what they were looking for in a replacement executive director
Yeah.
because they had this rift and they
Mhm.
didn't understand the other side of the coin. And so problems between the staff and the board are almost always symptoms of something larger, usually a lack of understanding or a focus on the organization's vision or its value system. It's important that the board with these kinds of issues receive some kind of what I'd call marriage counseling,
Yeah.
right? And it usually starts because the board CEO relationship isn't strong. And so if it's not strong, they need to get help. But I wish I'd known that that relationship was so critical because it affects everything else that happens in the organization.
Yeah.
The next thing I'd like to point out is that the CEO should not be the only one recruiting board members. It's something that many boards don't even think about. But if the nonprofit CEO is the one doing all of your board recruitment, I probably don't want to join that board. Right?
Right.
Look at the organizational chart. Do you really want your CEO handpicking his or her boss?
I've been in nonprofits where that was the case.
Right.
And it every board member was a friend or close person to the executive director. And all they're doing is just ensuring that they get to stay in power. That's
Correct.
all they're doing.
Well, if the CEO is your board's main recruiter, then your board likely has far more problems than you might suspect.
Yeah.
And so that has to change. But the board should be responsible for recruiting new board members, and it shouldn't be the CEO. The CEO can help, but they should not be the only one recruiting the board members. The next thing that I think is really important is that planning and implementation are two different things. And both of these things are needed on a nonprofit board. An organization needs plans for how it's going to impact the community and plans to speak to my passion for how it will ensure that it has the capacity to create that impact. If the board has plans, but no clue about the status of those plans, that's just as bad. So an organization's plans are your answer to the big question, why are we here? What are we trying to accomplish in our community? If the board can't answer those basic questions, then what exactly is the board doing? The board needs to understand that ensuring the organization is making the community a better place is one of their primary areas of responsibility. The next thing is that I wish I knew, point number 8, is that the bylaws determine how and if the board works. Right? People don't understand what the bylaws do, but but does the board have term limits, for example, or can someone be on the board forever? It's clear what types of actions could get someone thrown off the board, hopefully, if you have a good set of bylaws, and what the process would be for removing them.
Mhm.
Policies and procedures guide the board decisions and expectations. And I have to relate this story because it's right to this point. I had a board president once who called me for advice. And he said that one of his board members had embezzled money from their small nonprofit. But the rest of the board wouldn't vote to remove him from the board. And after I picked myself up off the floor, I asked if they had contacted the police or an attorney first, right? Because it's a legal issue first, and
Right.
then a policy issue second. He said, yeah, we had, and we know we need an attorney, but right now we need to convince the rest of the board to remove this guy. But they didn't have a policy. So without a policy, the rest of the board felt sorry for this embezzler, and they never voted to remove him. And so he stayed there, attending meetings and voting organizational matters month after month after they had figured this out. And so, as extreme as this appears to be, with no policies in place, the board was in a quandary about what to do or whether or not to remove their friend.
Right.
So if you're thinking that this couldn't happen to your board, you might be surprised at some of the kinds of bad behavior that I've seen, and probably you have seen too, Alicia, from otherwise rational people, right? Behavior that seems to only show itself when they find themselves on a nonprofit board. Without consistently applied board policies and procedures, it's more likely that your own odd set of circumstances could knock your board and your whole organization for a loop.
Right. And not to mention, they were completely ignoring the legal responsibilities
Yes,
they had
absolutely.
and the liability they were putting themselves in.
Absolutely. I was floored that they wouldn't do this, but they let him sit there for months. It only lasted about, I think it was 5 or 6 months, but he was there. He
Still
just
too
kept going.
long.
It
That's
should have
way
happened
too long.
immediately. Should have happened immediately, right?
Right.
But it didn't. So it's important. It's important to know that your bylaws determine how and if your board works. So you've got to have a good set of bylaws.
Right.
You don't try to wing it.
Right.
Someone has, told me once that, coming onto the board would be an easy thing, right? It's just come on, show up.
Yeah.
But the point is that that someone has to provide me some kind of training if I do. I can't just show up and expect to be a great board member
Right.
without knowing more information. So I've got a good board has to have a good orientation program, right? And new board members need to have more than just their little board packet, their board manual, and perhaps a tour of the facility. Because without training, how am I going to know what's expected of me?
Mhm.
And how's the organization going to be assured that I'm capable of guiding the organization? I often give long-standing boards a quiz about the organization. I remember I did this once with an easy question. Actually, all of them were easy questions, but it was like, what's your annual budget? Or name 3 positions the organization or programs the organization provides. Or name 1 staff aside from the executive director and tell me what their position is. Guess what? They all failed. They always fail.
Yeah.
So these boards don't understand that, and these are people that have been on the board sometimes for 20 years, which was a problem in and of itself. But
Right.
each and every one of them have failed the quiz. How can they govern if they don't have basic information about their organization? These were softball questions and nobody could answer them. So board members have to be well enough informed about the organization from the moment they're permitted to vote, because they won't be able to do the job otherwise. The organization has to ensure that every single board member understands how to read the financials, for instance, not just those people on the finance committee, but the whole board, so that every board member can be accountable for decisions that require financial understanding in that case, or programmatic understanding in another. You really do have to provide board members with orientation and training so that they can acquire the skills, if they don't have them, to do what you need them to do.
Right.
And then finally, the last thing that I came up with is, why do you want me anyway? Right? Why do you want me anyway? But it's an important question. It's going to sound ridiculously simple, but it's critically important to know why the organization wants me specifically to serve on their board.
Mhm.
Skills, talents, experience do I bring to the table that complement the rest of the team?
Mhm.
So being asked, like I have been many times, will you serve on our board of directors? Well, what do I have to do? Well, show up to a board meeting. It not be enough for me to secure such an important position.
Right.
Right? Warm blood and a pulse. That's what you hear all the time, right?
Right.
If I only had a nickel for every board who told me that that's their requirement for selecting a board member. It's just crazy to think that you're just going to have anybody lead this organization. A board's got to have a solid recruitment process that includes not only applications and interviews, but first and foremost, knowing what they're looking for and how that person fits into the mix. So those 10 things are what I wish I knew before I started before I joined a board. And I think it answers the question about, what board founders should be looking for as they create theirs.
Right. It's definitely food for thought for them to think through, because so many, and this is common, when you first form, you have to have 3 people to be legal. So
Mhm.
they just go like, you, and you now,
Right.
But then once you get past that and become a 501(c)(3), that's when you really have to start looking at who you need to build that board with or build that organization with.
Yes.
Well, other than what we've just gone through, are there some common questions that you hear when it comes to new nonprofits and boards?
Yeah, that's a good question. They do those questions tend to fall into some general categories, right? And the first one that new nonprofit founders come to me with is, how can I get grants? Right? How do I get
Yeah.
grants? As if grants are the solution to every problem you have. Well, it's not. The
Well, that's what
answer
they've
is
been
you might
told.
not be ready for grants. So,
Yeah.
so that shouldn't be the first question out of their mouth, but it almost always is.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And we don't have to get into why that's important, but grants are not always the solution that you think they are. The second question that I think I get most is, how do I get board members? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Where do I go to get them? As if there's some magical formula, magical kind of a person that's a board member, right?
There's a pond out there. You just throw in your
Right.
board.
So how do I get board members? Well, how do you get anybody to do anything? You have to ask them. You got to identify someone and you've got to ask them. But again, we won't necessarily get into the answers to all these questions, but that's another very important question that you have to answer for yourself. How do you get board members? Well, you have to think about it. Think about who those people are and where you would go, starting with your inner circle and then working out to others that they may know. So that's the second question. Another thing I get is, what am I allowed to do as a nonprofit? Right? When founders start a nonprofit, they think again that the nonprofit entity is some magical, mystical entity that has special rules that doesn't apply to anybody else. And that's just not the case. Every nonprofit is a nonprofit corporation, and it's designed that way for a reason, right? It's a shared leadership kind of thing. But the quick answer to that question is, you can do everything a for-profit can do, pretty much, except take proceeds and benefit individuals, right? You can't do that. But in terms of the business side of things, you can buy property, you can hire employees, you can give away gifts and make grants, and you can do all kinds of things. But you can do everything pretty much that a for-profit can do as well. So stop thinking about it as if it's got some magical, mystical property that any business wouldn't have. If you operate it like a business, not that it is a business, because it's not a business, but if you operate it and put in place business practices, you should be fine. You should be able to do just about everything that a for-profit does. And so then there's a final question that I get, which I think is particularly apropos to today's topic, and that is, how do I get my board to ... Right? How do I get my board to raise money? How do I get my board to attend meetings? How do I get my board to advocate? Right?
Right.
You can insert a whole range of things there. How do I get my board to? And that's a more complex question, but again, you have to just think logically about it. How do you get anyone to do anything? You've got to spell out what it is you want from them and then ask them to do it. And if you don't know what it is, then you've got to educate yourself on what it is that you want them to do and how they can do it. So those are probably the most common questions I get, Alicia.
Okay. So, what are the typical challenges that nonprofit founders face, particularly in board development,
Yeah.
and how can they be overcome?
Okay, well, I think the first challenge with board development is recruiting the right people. We've already alluded to it, right?
Right.
You got to have the right people around the table. So you've got to understand what it is you want. I think the 10 points that I just went through
Right.
about the reasons that things I wish I knew before I joined the board, that answers the question. You got to have the right people sitting around the table that can handle those kinds of things that come up within a nonprofit organization. So that's the first and foremost. Get the right people sitting around the table, understand what that means to have the right people, and what it means for those people to be doing their jobs effectively. The second thing is you have to engage board members, particularly in fundraising. Okay, board members have to be involved in fundraising, and it's a challenge to sometimes get them to do it for a whole host of reasons. But that's another challenge. Getting people to actually raise money for you, or to be involved in the fundraising process at all. And I'm gonna talk about that in a minute, but I'll just leave it there for now. The third thing I think that is a real challenge is knowing what to share with board members, not only as they're recruited, but as the organization goes on. Does it become a board decision or does it become a management decision, right? What do I bring to the board to be put on the agenda, for instance? How much information should I give them when I'm orienting them? And I think for the most part, the answer to this question is the more transparent you can be with the board, the more you can share with them, the better. They shouldn't be kept in the dark. They're the ones making the decision. So share with them as much as you possibly can, because again, they need to know as much of the information as they can to make good decisions. Excuse me.
Okay.
And then finally, the last challenge, or the most typical challenge, is how do I remove board members? How do we remove board members who are either ineffective or just plain nasty and ugly and are not contributing to the good of the overall organization? And it goes back again to your bylaws. You've got to have bylaws in place that address this, and then you've got to tactfully approach board members to try to figure out whether or not they're doing the job that you set out to do. And so it starts at the beginning. It starts at number one, recruiting the right people. And if you've got the right people in place and they understand their roles and responsibilities, they're going to know whether or not they're doing their job. And if you can sit down once a year, and the board chair should do this, by the way, sit down once a year with your board members, every single board member, and you evaluate their performance against their job description. And if they're doing their job well, you keep them. If they're not doing their job well, like a staff member, you get rid of them and you don't invite them back.
Exactly.
So it's not that difficult, but those are the four, I think, biggest challenges that I've seen nonprofit founders face.
Okay, so now I'm going to move into some frequently asked questions that I hear and see and get, and it's all about boards. So first one is, how do I recruit and select members for my board or for my nonprofit? We've touched on this a little bit. Do you have any extra insights?
Just what I've said, getting the right people in place, and how do you do it? Well, there are methods to recruit board members. The one that I like to use is a basic brainstorming session in which you bring people together, especially if you're feeling like you're someone who doesn't have a big network. Find a leader in your community, or someone who's well networked. It could be a realtor, a banker, a CEO, a pastor. Those are always good. Find someone who's willing to host a meeting for you, a one-time meeting, right? And you bring a handful of community people together, people who are connected to other people, and you might have 5 or 6 people there in the meeting. It doesn't have to be huge. It might include some of your board members, it might not. But you bring a group together and you do brainstorming, a simple brainstorming session where you list potential people that could serve on your board, right? And you have a nice coffee or a dinner or whatever, and you talk about who these people are and why they'd make good board members. I've used this process very, very effectively for many years, and I always end up with a list of 30 or 40 names right?
Mhm.
And that we can take then and then go through, why is this guy good? Why is this person bad? And we
Right.
rank them and we give them a first 10, 1 through 10. Those are our 10 top prospects. And then we go about recruiting them. And we're going about sitting down and visiting them and talking about the fact that someone in your community feels you'd be a good board member and we'd like to talk to you about it. So I think that's a great process to use to refine new board members.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. So the next question I hear are, what are the roles and responsibilities of nonprofit board members?
Okay, well, there are 10. Okay, 10 basic ones, and I'll just go through them really, really quickly. Okay, I'm not going to elaborate on them,
Okay.
but I believe initially this list that I use came from Board Source, which is the national organization for all things board.
Right.
And it's a great organization. But anyway, the first thing is that the board needs to determine your mission and your purposes.
Mhm.
Right? The board's responsible for the organization's mission and making sure that it's clearly stated. So
Mhm.
that's number one. Number two, and I said this before to other people and other boards, and they were surprised at this. But the second thing is that they have to hire the chief executive. They
Mhm.
have a responsibility to hire and manage a chief executive. And so many boards don't even think about, the fact that they are responsible for bringing the person on. And succession planning, of course, has become a watchword in today's boardrooms. And many boards just pay lip service to it and they don't do any planning. They have no plan for how they're going to hire their chief executive, but you've got to have a plan in place, as I love to do for everything, of course,
Yeah.
so that when you're ready to hire a chief executive, you know how it's going to happen and you
Right.
just don't wing it. So that's the second thing. The third thing is the board has to support and evaluate their chief executive, right? That's what the board is really there to do. The frontline workers, if you will, are your staff, your executive director and your chief executive and your staff. And so it's so easy to beat up on them for for all the ills of the organization. But the board isn't there to beat up on them. The board is there to support them. The
Right.
board is there to evaluate, because again, they're actually doing a lot of the work of the organization. And so when you beat them up, they just get demoralized and they leave. So you're there to support and evaluate the chief executive in particular, but not the rest of the staff. Quite frankly, it's not the board's job to deal with the staff. It's the board's job to deal with the chief executive. The chief executive deals with the staff.
Yeah.
I say that way because I've seen board members form relationships with staff members, and you end up circumventing the chief executive, and you don't want to ever do that. So the third responsibility is to support and evaluate the chief executive. The fourth thing is that the board has to ensure that there's a plan in place for
Yeah.
accomplishing your objectives. You got to ensure effective planning because without a plan, nothing will happen. That's why so many boards are dysfunctional. They don't have a plan.
Right.
The board has to be responsible for monitoring and strengthening the programs, not for necessarily creating all the programs or implementing all the programs, but monitoring them and
Right.
strengthening them and making sure that the impact is taking place that you want to have take place.
Right.
A really critical element is the next one, and that is to ensure adequate financial resources. Most boards don't understand it. It's their job to make sure that there's money to run the organization. It's not the executive director's job. It's not the staff's job. It's the board's job to make sure there are adequate financial resources. If that means hiring a fundraiser, that's what you got to do.
Yeah.
But you've got to make sure that the money is there in order to operate, or else you're not going to be able to operate. You're not going to be able to have the impact that you're planning to make, right?
Right.
So that's a really key one. And then once you have some money and you have some assets, you have to provide financial oversight and protect the assets that you have,
Mm-hmm.
right? Whether it's cash or property or anything else.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the seventh point. The eighth point is that the board is responsible for building their own board.
Yeah.
They are responsible for recruiting people and making sure that the board perpetuates itself, right? And that you don't come crashing down when, if, for instance, you have term limits and everybody leaves and you've got no board members. You got to always have a sort of a prospective list of potential board members that you can bring on board and refresh the pot every now and then. The ninth point that I'd like to make is that the board is responsible for enhancing the organization's public standing. That means they need to be ambassadors, right? They need to get out there and tell the story. They play an important role in representing the organization to funders, to the community, to elected officials, to all kinds of stakeholders. Right. So they have to know what they're doing and what their program and what they're ambassadoring about, if that's a phrase. They have to understand, all of that stuff in order to be good ambassadors and to enhance the organization's public standing. And then finally, we've touched on this in one of our comments earlier. They have to ensure both legal and ethical integrity. The board has an important role in compliance, in transparency, and accountability. And so the board has to define, for instance, what constitutes a conflict of interest, right? How they're going to deal with conflicts, what their code of conduct is going to be, what the whistleblower policy is going to be. I always say that the board really should be spending a lot of their time dealing with policies and leaving the other stuff to the staff. But it's a key role, is to ensure legal and ethical integrity. And so those are the 10 things I think are the most important roles and responsibilities of the board.
Okay. So how can I ensure effective board meetings and strong board engagement?
Well, I think there are a few things. The first thing is that you need to recruit a strong board chair. And by a strong board chair, I mean someone who is able to control the board. Someone who's not afraid of the other board members, right?
Right.
Someone who can lead the agenda and be strong in keeping people focused on the task at hand. And so you need a good board chair or a strong board chair. Another thing I think is really important is you have to have a written agenda. And you should share that agenda before your meeting, as well as any other material that you might have that goes along with that agenda, right? And so if you want to be effective, you've got to communicate with people. You've got to let people know what's coming up. And so your board has to have this information in advance. And then once you've done those two things, I think when it comes to the actual board meeting day, follow the agenda. Don't let board members sidetrack you. I've been to so many board meetings, and I've led board meetings where board members have tried to sort of just take you off track on things that have nothing to do with what you're there to talk about. But a good board chair is going to be able to follow the agenda, right? So if they're strong, they'll keep it focused. They'll make sure that the things that are on the agenda are getting accomplished, and that you're moving through that in a timely and hopefully swift fashion. Which leads me to the next point, and that is you really need to put time limits on the agenda. I always had an agenda that had, say, 15 minutes executive director report, 2 minutes treasurer's report,
Right.
5 minutes property report. And you could see exactly how much time it's amazing when you put a time limit on the agenda and you print it right on the agenda, how people can suddenly get through a lot of material very quickly.
Right.
And so it enhances the meeting because it makes it flow faster, and you're not talking about all kinds of stuff you don't need to be talking about.
Right.
So put time limits on, and then integrate your plan, whatever plan that might be. If you have a strategic plan or an organizational plan or a fundraising plan, organize that or integrate that into the agenda so that you can monitor your progress during the board meeting, right? So that as you make committee reports or people on the board make reports about what they're doing, they're reporting on your plan, on the progress you're making on your plan. And not just on what makes them feel important.
Right.
Right. So that's really, really important. And then one thing that I found that's really key, and it's hard to do, but I think it's, if you have a good, strong board chair, you can make it happen. Don't come together as a board unless you have some kind of action to take or some decision to make. Just because you have a plan to meet monthly doesn't mean you need to meet monthly. Because the worst thing you can do is come together and talk and talk and talk and accomplish nothing.
Mhm.
That's going to scare people away, and they're not going to want to show up. As we've mentioned, I think in one of my points earlier in the day.
Right.
So don't come together unless you have actions to take or decisions to make. And then finally, I think it's really important, and this sounds simple, but it's hard to do again. Start your meetings on time and end your meetings on time, especially end your meeting on time.
Right.
Even if you don't start on time, because people love to be able to get out of a meeting early, right?
Yeah.
And
They'll never complain about that.
they never complain about getting out early or on time. They always complain about, oh, this took forever. I was
Well,
there 2 hours longer than I needed to be, right?
right. And they won't want to show up either if
Right.
you do those things.
Right. So don't come together. I mean, start your meeting on time and then end your meeting on time, and you'll be in good shape.
Yeah. You talked about the time setting.
Mhm.
I've been in board meetings before where there was a timekeeper, and she had her phone set, and when you heard the quack, you knew we were done. You had to stop, and we were either moving on or we were saying, okay, there's more discussion that needs to be had. Let's continue this to the next meeting.
I love that. I love that. That's a great idea.
But, but you didn't want to get to that dreaded quack.
Right. I never thought to use it as a board chair. I never really thought to use something like that. I wish I had, because that's a great idea.
Well, it had to be implemented. It was one of those, we've got to do something. What can we do?
Right. That's
Okay,
fantastic.
so our last question today, and I do appreciate your time.
Sure.
What training or resources should I provide to my board members?
Yeah, well, I think we've already mentioned the importance of training, right? The first thing you need is that you need a good onboarding and orientation process. And what I like to include in my orientation packet is, first of all, an organizational budget, a financial statement of some sort, maybe a profit and a loss for the last quarter. You want to include your bylaws, your minutes, maybe of your last 3 meetings, so that board members can see what's going on, a conflict of interest statement, a description of all your programs, your staff, and your board members. That's the minimum, I think. You can include other information, but at least those things should be sort of in your orientation packet. You have to, board members have to understand how your specific nonprofit operates, right? Who does what and why, and what those challenges are, so that they can be prepared to make better decisions as a board. So don't be afraid to be totally transparent. The board's going to find out what's really happening eventually. So
Right.
if there's a weakness in a process or a person, let the board know about it. It's better that they not be blindsided.
Mhm.
And then give them training. If you need to give them training on how to be a board member, there are all kinds of board development trainings that you can hire people to come in and do, or maybe they could do voluntary or pro bono. But I'd like to give all of my board members training in fundraising specifically, because that's a key part of their job, to go out and make sure the resources are available, right? And so, and ask others to come and support it. So, but most nonprofit leaders feel that they don't know enough about fundraising to train their board members in fundraising specifically. And so what I like to say to those people is, give your board members then an experience in fundraising. If you don't have the background, or you can't afford to have somebody come in, or no one available to come in who knows how to answer those questions, give them an experience in fundraising, and then they'll learn about the process of fundraising along the way. You know, not every board member has to ask for money to be involved with or to learn about fundraising.
Mhm.
As you know, if you've ever had to do it, and I know you're an accomplished, Alicia, you're an accomplished fundraiser. Fundraising is really a series of 10,000 tasks.
Yes.
And they all have to be done. Sometimes all have to be done at once, it seems.
Yeah.
And if you want to train your board in fundraising specifically, train them in a specific fundraising task and explain why that task is important, right? So maybe it's coming in and helping you. In the old days, we used to mail envelopes, mail letters out to people, right? But maybe there's a social media campaign that you need help with, and board members can take a task, whatever that task may be, that supports your fundraising effort.
Mhm.
Putting things into context and letting the board members know why they're doing what they're doing makes all the difference in the world. Just think about it. If I'm planning to conduct a fundraising event, let's say a walk or a golf tournament, there are a million places that I can plug a board member into that don't require that the board member asks someone for money.
Mhm.
But it's an important fundraising task anyway, right?
Mhm.
It's got to get done.
Right.
And so as these board members get involved in that particular task, and as they become comfortable doing it, they will be supporting your fundraising effort and learning what it takes to do fundraising.
Mhm.
And that's how you train your board members in fundraising. Now you can complement that training with more formal training, maybe a session at a board meeting where you talk about the common objections to giving and getting money, for example. But I found that experiential learning works the best, especially with boards. You may also want to offer board training specifically on board recruitment, right? Because it's the job of every board to perpetuate itself, and many don't know how to make that happen.
Mhm.
And again, there are a whole host of recruitment resources available to do this.
Mhm.
And one of those resources is my free download that I have on my website. It's called Tools for Building a Dynamic Board. And it's available. It covers all the things we've talked about and more in today's session. And you can find that at my website at www.razorsharpconsulting.com. And razor is spelled like fundraiser because that's what I consider myself. RAISER, Razor Sharp Consulting. I think you'll find that resource very, very useful.
All right. And if anyone would like to contact you outside of Facebook, because I'm assuming you are open to messages in Facebook.
Absolutely. Contact me on Facebook. Contacting me through my website is very easy to do.
Okay.
I'm not going to list my email address here, but again, you can contact me through my contact form on razorsharpconsulting.com.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Joe, for being here. It's always a pleasure to get to talk to you.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate your thorough and involved questions there.
Well, I'm hoping that they get some value out of what we do, and that they know now what you do and how you do it. So maybe when they have those questions, they'll think of you first.
Absolutely. If I can help anyone improve their nonprofit in any way, that's what drives me. That's what I love to do. I'm particularly fond of small nonprofits and startup nonprofits. So reach out to me, and I'll be happy to answer your questions and engage with you in overcoming whatever obstacle you're facing.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And that's all for this Meet the Expert. And we will see you again some other time.